Picture yourself now as a young woman of 15 in the year 1356, standing in a cold stone chamber as the sun sets on your wedding day. The celebration below continues. You can hear the muffled sounds of music and laughter rising through the floorboards, but you've been led away by older women. Their faces a mixture of sympathy and solemnity. They're preparing you for what comes next. Your hands are shaking, but not from cold. You've been given wine more than usual, and you understand why. The women around you speak in quiet voices, offering advice that ranges from practical to terrifying. One tells you to pray. Another tells you to remain still. A third whispers something about endurance, about duty, about the price women pay for the security of marriage. You are, in most ways that matter, a stranger to the man who will enter this room tonight. You've perhaps met him a handful of times, spoken to him even less. The marriage was arranged by your father, negotiated like a business transaction, which is precisely what it was. And now the transaction must be consummated, must be witnessed, indirectly, must be proven, because your family's honor and your future security depend on what happens in this bed tonight. This is not a love story, this is not romance. This is the brutal reality that waited at the end of nearly every medieval wedding, and it's time we spoke plainly about why wedding nights filled young women with dread rather than anticipation. Before we continue into this uncomfortable history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. This is a difficult topic, but it's one that deserves honest examination. If you're comfortable sharing, drop your location in the comments. I'm always curious where these stories find their audience. Here's the blunt truth. Most medieval girls entered marriage with virtually no understanding of what sexual intercourse actually entailed. Imagine yourself growing up in a medieval household, whether noble or common, where sex was simply not discussed with unmarried girls. The concept of sex education didn't exist. Mothers didn't sit down with daughters to explain the mechanics of marital relations. The church certainly didn't provide guidance beyond vague references to wifely duty and the sinfulness of carnal pleasure. What information did filter through came in fragments, in whispers, in the nervous conversations between young women who themselves barely understood. You might have seen animals mating and understood dimly that something similar happened between humans. You might have overheard crude jokes from servants or soldiers, understanding the laughter if not the content, but explicit, accurate information that was withheld, deliberately, under the assumption that innocence and ignorance were virtues to be preserved until the wedding night. A curious note from confessors' manuals: priests were instructed on how to question married women about their sexual lives during confession, but the same manuals explicitly warn against discussing such matters with unmarried women lest it corrupt their innocence or worse, give them ideas that might lead to sin. Here's what this meant in practice. A girl might reach her wedding day understanding only that something painful and shameful was expected of her. Something that had to happen but should never be enjoyed, something that was simultaneously her duty and her degradation. The psychological preparation for her wedding night consisted largely of being told to submit, to obey, and to endure. Scholars still argue about how universal this ignorance was. Certainly some mothers did offer guidance, some older sisters or female relatives provided more honest preparation. Rural girls who grew up around farm animals might have had a more practical understanding than sheltered noble women, but the overwhelming message from the available sources is clear. Ignorance was the norm, and that ignorance transformed the wedding night into something terrifying. You need to understand the ages we're discussing. Picture yourself now as a girl of 12, 13, 14, because these were common marriage ages for medieval girls, particularly among the nobility. Canon law set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls, 14 for boys, and these minimums were treated not as cautionary floors but as acceptable standards. A wealthy merchant's daughter might be betrothed at 10 and married at 13. A noble heiress could find herself married even younger if political circumstances demanded it. The groom, by contrast, was often significantly older, perhaps in his 20s or 30s, sometimes older still. A 40-year-old nobleman marrying a 13-year-old girl was not scandalous, it was strategic. Here's the plain fact: these were children. Their bodies were not fully developed, their minds were not mature, and yet they were expected to fulfill the physical and psychological demands of marriage, including sexual relations, because the medieval world did not recognize childhood as we understand it. Once you reached the age of 12 or 14, you were considered capable of adult responsibilities, whether or not that capability actually existed. The wedding night for such a girl was not merely intimidating. It was a form of institutionalized trauma. She might barely understand what was happening to her. Her body might not be ready for sexual activity, and the man in the room with her, regardless of his own character or intentions, represented an overwhelming power differential: older, larger, legally entitled to her body, socially empowered to take what the marriage contract guaranteed him. Historians remain divided over how many medieval men showed consideration or restraint on the wedding night. But the sources suggest it was not the norm. The concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval law. A husband had rights to his wife's body, and those rights were absolute. If he chose to exercise them immediately and forcefully, no law prevented him, no social sanction awaited him. Now here's where medieval practice becomes almost surreal in its cruelty. The public nature of the wedding night. Imagine yourself led to the marriage bed by a procession of wedding guests. This was called the bedding ceremony, and it was a standard feature of medieval weddings, particularly among the nobility. The specifics varied by region and social class, but the fundamental elements remained consistent across medieval Europe. You, the bride, are undressed or partially undressed by the women in attendance. The groom is similarly prepared by them. You're both led to the bed, often with ribald songs and crude jokes echoing through the chamber. Guests might throw stockings at the bed, or sprinkle it with grain or herbs for fertility, or offer loud advice and encouragement. Then critically, you're blessed by a priest. The bed itself is blessed. Prayers are said over you, sanctifying what's about to happen, transforming it from mere animal coupling into a sacramental duty. The guests withdraw, though in some traditions, witnesses might actually remain in the room, hidden behind screens or curtains, ready to verify that consummation occurred. Here's the blunt truth. This ceremony served multiple purposes, none of them about your comfort or emotional well-being. It publicly demonstrated that the marriage had progressed to its physical conclusion. It provided witnesses who could testify if the marriage's validity was later questioned. It reinforced the social and religious authority over your body and your sexuality, and it rendered what should have been an intimate moment into a semi-public spectacle. A curious note from English royal weddings: the bedding ceremony for Henry VII and Elizabeth of York in 1486 was described in chronicle accounts with remarkable detail. The procession, the blessings, the withdrawal of witnesses. What happened after the witnesses left is of course unrecorded, but the very fact that witnesses were present until the last possible moment tells you everything about medieval priorities. You lie there now, in our imagination, with the door finally closed, the guests finally departed, alone with a man you barely know. Your body trembling not with anticipation but with fear. The room is cold. The bed, despite all the ceremony and blessing, is just a bed. That duty to family and husband must override personal discomfort. There's sympathy there, but no suggestion that the situation could or should be different. Here's the blunt truth. Many medieval women entered marriage already traumatized by anticipation. The dread they felt was not irrational or excessive. It was a reasonable response to what they knew was coming. And after the wedding night, that dread often transformed into resignation, or in some cases into lasting psychological damage that medieval society had no framework for recognizing or treating. Now here's where we must acknowledge complexity. Not all medieval grooms were monsters, and not all wedding nights were brutish assaults. Picture yourself fortunate enough to marry a man who, despite the absolute power society grants him, chooses to exercise restraint. Such men existed. Historical sources give us glimpses of grooms who postponed consummation when their brides were very young, who showed patience or gentleness, who understood, however dimly, that forcing themselves on a terrified child bride was wrong even if it was legal. There are accounts of marriages where consummation was delayed by mutual agreement or by the groom's choice until the bride was older. There are suggestions in some sources that certain medieval men took seriously the Church's teachings about marriage as a spiritual partnership, not just a sexual contract. But here's what you must understand. These men were working against every social and legal expectation of their time. A husband who showed too much consideration for his wife's feelings might be mocked by other men as weak or controlled by his wife. A marriage that remained unconsummated for too long invited questions about the groom's virility or the bride's willingness. The social pressure was always toward immediate consummation, toward the husband exercising his rights, toward establishing the physical reality of the marriage as quickly as possible. Historians still argue about what constituted a typical male behavior on the wedding night. The sources are limited and biased, written almost exclusively by men from a perspective that assumed male authority and female submission as natural and proper. What we can say with confidence is that the range existed, from genuine brutality to something approaching consideration, but the structural realities meant that even the best-case scenarios still involved a massive power imbalance and a young woman with limited ability to refuse or negotiate. The truth probably lies here. Most medieval grooms were not deliberately cruel, but they also didn't think deeply about their bride's experience. They were fulfilling a social role, exercising their rights, doing what was expected of them. The bride's fear or pain was regrettable, perhaps, but not a reason to delay or reconsider. Marriage had occurred. Consummation must follow. This was simply the order of things. You wake now and the ordeal has a sequel. Imagine yourself the morning after your wedding night, lying in that bed as dawn light filters through the shutters. Your body aches in new ways. You might be bleeding. You're exhausted, but sleep has been difficult or impossible. The man beside you, your husband now in every sense, might still be sleeping, might be already awake, might be preparing to leave the chamber. And then comes the inspection. Here's the plain fact. In many medieval cultures, the wedding bed sheets were examined for blood, proof of the bride's virginity and proof that consummation had occurred. This examination might be conducted by the groom's family, by older women in the household, or in royal or high noble marriages by official witnesses. The bloody sheet might be displayed, literally shown to family members or wedding guests as evidence that the marriage was valid and complete. This practice varied by region and social class. It was more common in southern Europe than northern, more common among nobility than peasants, but where it occurred, it added another layer of humiliation to an already traumatic experience. Picture yourself as a young woman who must now face people who know intimately what happened to you the previous night. The women who examine the sheets, the family members who view them, the guests who hear that consummation has been proven. All of them have knowledge of your body and your experience that would be considered violating in any modern context. A curious note from Spanish sources. In some regions, the bloodied sheet might be preserved as a legal document, stored with other family records as proof of the bride's virginity at marriage. This could become relevant if the marriage was later disputed or if the wife's reputation was questioned. The most intimate physical evidence of her wedding night might be dragged out years later as ammunition in legal or social conflicts. And what if there was no blood? This was a genuine terror for medieval brides. Not all women bleed during first intercourse. Urines vary in thickness. Some break during childhood activities. Some are naturally thin or absent. But medieval medicine didn't understand this variability. The absence of blood could lead to accusations of prior sexual activity, to the bride being returned to her family in disgrace, to the marriage being annulled. Here's the blunt truth. Some wedding nights involved deliberate injury to ensure bleeding would occur. A considerate husband might use his finger to tear the hymen carefully rather than forcefully through intercourse. A less considerate one might simply force the issue. Some medieval medical texts actually advise this, treating the production of blood as more important than the woman's pain or well-being. Now understand this, the wedding night was not an isolated ordeal. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of a woman's life. Picture yourself in the days and weeks following your marriage. Your husband has rights to your body, not occasionally, not when you're willing, but essentially whenever he desires. The concept of marital consent didn't exist. Refusing your husband was grounds for punishment, social condemnation, or worse. The church taught that wives owed their husbands the marriage debt. Sexual access was not a gift, but an obligation. If the wedding night was painful, subsequent encounters might remain painful, particularly if you're very young or if there was injury that hasn't properly healed. Medieval medicine offered little help. Discussing sexual pain with a physician would be shameful and difficult. Most women endured in silence, because endurance was what was expected. And then inevitably for most medieval women came pregnancy. The wedding night's purpose, ultimately, was procreation. A wife who didn't become pregnant within a reasonable time faced questions about her fertility, or worse, suspicions about whether the marriage was being properly consummated, whether she was using contraceptive herbs, whether she was somehow defective as a woman. Here's the plain fact. Pregnancy in the medieval period was dangerous. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 2% of births resulted in the mother's death, which meant that over the course of multiple pregnancies, a woman's cumulative risk was substantial. Many women died in childbirth. Many more suffered permanent injuries, fistulas, prolapse, hemorrhaging that left them weak for years. So the wedding night, that initial trauma, was also the gateway to a life defined by repeated sexual access you couldn't refuse, and pregnancies that might kill you. Is it any wonder that young women approached their weddings with dread rather than joy? Scholars have worked to recover what we can of medieval women's actual voices on these matters, and what we find is telling. A curious note from medieval letters and diaries. When women did write about marriage, the language is often coded, but the emotion is clear. A 14th century Italian woman's diary speaks of her wedding day with formulaic praise for her husband and family, but when describing her early married life she writes, "I prayed often in those first months for God to grant me strength and for my husband to be merciful." Another source, a collection of letters from French noblewomen, includes advice to a newly married cousin. Remember that what seems unendurable becomes merely familiar with time. These aren't celebrations of marital bliss, they're documents of survival and adaptation. The church taught that women were created as helpmeets for men, as vessels for childbearing, as partners in salvation, but distinctly subordinate partners. Eve's sin in Eden meant that women must submit to their husbands, must accept pain in childbirth, must endure the consequences of feminine weakness. This wasn't cruelty. This was divine justice, the natural order established by God himself. Sexual pleasure was deeply suspect in medieval theology. The only fully justified reason for sexual intercourse was procreation. Even within marriage, sex undertaken for pleasure rather than duty was technically sinful, though this sin was considered minor and inevitable. The implication for women was clear. You should not expect pleasure, should not seek it, should perhaps feel shame if you experience it. Here's the blunt truth. This theological framework transformed a traumatic experience into a spiritual test. Your suffering on your wedding night and in your marriage bed afterward wasn't just unfortunate. It was meaningful, part of God's plan for women, a penance for Eve's sin and a path to salvation through submission and motherhood. A curious note from confessors' manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married women during confession about various sexual sins, refusing their husbands, seeking pleasure using contraception, engaging in non-procreative sexual acts. But they were not instructed to ask about husbands forcing themselves on unwilling wives because that wasn't considered sinful. The sexual sins that concerned the medieval church were almost all about women failing to submit or men failing to confine their lust to marriage. Violence within marriage simply wasn't a category of sin. This theological justification was powerful because it made resistance not just difficult but spiritually dangerous. A woman who resisted her husband wasn't just difficult or disobedient, she was defying God's order, endangering her soul. The dread you felt as a medieval bride was thus compounded by guilt for feeling that dread, by the sense that you should accept this suffering as your divinely appointed role. Picture yourself now, years later, an older woman watching your own daughter approach her wedding day. What do you tell her? Do you prepare her honestly for what's coming, knowing that honesty might increase her terror? Do you offer comforting lies, knowing they'll be exposed as lies on her wedding night? Do you simply repeat the same platitudes about duty and endurance that were offered to you? Here's what we know from the sources. Most women chose some version of evasion or minimalization. They offered vague warnings, general advice about submission and patience, perhaps practical guidance about avoiding pregnancy or managing pain. But they rarely offered full honesty, because what would be the point? The daughter would marry regardless. The wedding night would happen regardless. Why burden her with specific fears when general dread was already sufficient? This generational silence meant that each cohort of young women faced their wedding nights in the same state of ignorant terror that their mothers and grandmothers had faced. The trauma was perpetuated not out of malice but out of a kind of grim pragmatism. This was simply how things were, and preparing girls too explicitly for the reality might break their spirits before they developed the resilience to endure. Scholars debate whether this constitutes intergenerational trauma in the clinical sense, but the pattern is clear. Women who had survived traumatic wedding nights rarely worked to prevent their daughters from experiencing similar trauma. They couldn't prevent the marriages, couldn't change the law or social expectations. So they focused on helping their daughters survive and adapt, just as they had survived and adapted. A curious note from medieval conduct books. Books of advice for mothers on raising daughters include extensive guidance on teaching obedience, modesty, and household skills, but almost nothing on preparing girls for marriage beyond emphasizing submission to their future husband. The silence in these sources is itself revealing. Marriage preparation meant spiritual and practical preparation, not honest discussion of the sexual realities that await. Now here's a question historians struggle with. Did medieval women eventually adapt to their circumstances, finding some satisfaction or normalcy in their marriages, or did they simply learn to endure and hide their suffering? Picture yourself 5 years into your marriage. You've survived multiple pregnancies. You've learned what your husband expects and how to minimize conflict. The initial terror of the wedding night has faded into something more like resignation. Are you happy? Are you content? Or have you simply learned not to examine your own feelings too closely because doing so serves no purpose? The sources don't give us easy answers. We have letters from medieval women expressing affection for their husband. We have wills where women bequeath gifts to their spouses with language suggesting genuine care. We have records of women grieving when their husbands died. But we also have sources suggesting ongoing suffering. Medical texts describe women with chronic pain from childbearing. Legal records document women fleeing marriages or seeking church intervention against abusive husbands. Literary sources include female characters who speak longingly of the freedom they had before marriage or who envy women who remained unmarried. Here's the truth that historians are increasingly acknowledging. Both things were probably true simultaneously. Medieval women learned to find whatever joy or satisfaction was available within their circumstances. They formed affectionate bonds with husbands when possible. They found meaning in motherhood and household management. They created lives that weren't defined solely by trauma, but they also carried the weight of that initial trauma, of the ongoing lack of bodily autonomy, of the constant vulnerability to pregnancy and its risk. They adapted because humans are remarkably adaptive. But adaptation isn't the same as acceptance or happiness. It's survival, and survival is its own achievement. But we shouldn't mistake it for thriving. Picture yourself one last time as that young woman on her wedding night, standing in that cold chamber waiting for what comes next. You are not unique. You are one of millions of medieval women who stood in similar chambers, felt similar fear, endured similar experiences. Your individual story is lost to history. Unless you're a queen or a saint, your name won't survive. Your personal feelings won't be recorded. Your suffering won't be memorialized. But you happened. You existed. Your dread was real. Your pain was. Your endurance mattered, even if only to you. Even if history forgot you the moment you drew your last breath. The medieval wedding night for most women was not a celebration but a crisis. The moment when the abstractions of marriage became physical reality, when duty manifested as pain, when the subordination encoded in law and theology was written into their bodies. They survived it not because it wasn't that bad, but because the alternative to surviving was a kind of psychological death. And most humans will choose survival even under the worst circumstances. They found ways to frame their experiences as meaningful, as religious duty, as family obligation, as the price of security. They relied on networks of other women who understood because they'd endured the same. They looked forward to whatever small freedoms and satisfactions their futures might hold, and gradually over the years, some of them did find something resembling contentment. Not all. Some spent their lives in quiet misery or loud rebellion, but some adapted, found affection in their marriages, took pride in their children, built lives that weren't defined solely by that initial trauma. But the trauma happened first. That's what we can't forget when we romanticize medieval marriage, or imagine that arranged marriages worked just fine, because medieval people didn't know any better. They knew, they felt, they suffered, and the wedding night was where that suffering often began. The medieval night is long over. The practices that made it so traumatic have been abandoned. At least in most of the world, we've recognized slowly and perfectly, but genuinely, that marriage should involve consent, that wedding nights should be anticipated with joy rather than dread, that women are not vessels or property but autonomous beings, with rights to their own bodies. But the lessons remain.